It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the leaves crunched underfoot and the golden hues of the season glowed under the soft sunlight. Jason, a successful businessman with an air of confidence, parked his sleek black car outside a boutique hotel in the heart of the city. Today was a day he never thought he'd attend. His ex-girlfriend, Vanessa, was getting married. Vanessa, who once held his heart, had moved on to someone wealthier, someone who checked all the boxes she cared about. And now, she was marrying into a world of even more opulence and status. Jason had received the invite, not out of affection, but perhaps as a reminder of what she thought he could never be enough. He didn't care much for the wedding itself. He had already moved on, or so he told himself. Yet, as he watched guests file into the grand venue in their finest clothes, a surge of resentment bubbled inside him. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a spectacle, a showcase of how far Vanessa had climbed up the social ladder. Jason clenched his jaw, his thoughts swirling with the idea of showing up, not as the rejected man, but with someone unexpected. Something that would cause a stir, shake things up. That's when he noticed her, sitting on a bench near the corner of the street, bundled up in a worn-out coat, holding a small sign. Homeless. Anything helps. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe in her late 20s, with a face hidden beneath her long, tangled hair. There was a quiet dignity about her, even though life had clearly thrown her into a dark place. An idea sparked in Jason's mind. What if he didn't just attend the wedding like any other guest? What if he showed up with someone no one expected? Someone that would break the perfect, polished image of the day. A homeless woman at a wedding filled with society's elite. The thought both amused and intrigued him. His ex and her new wealthy circle would never see it coming. The satisfaction of seeing their shocked expressions was too tempting to resist. Jason walked over to the woman, who barely looked up as he approached. "Excuse me," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I have a proposal for you." She glanced up, her eyes filled with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. "A proposal?" she echoed, clearly confused. Jason crouched down to meet her gaze. "I'm going to a wedding today, and I need someone to come with me. It's an important event, and I thought, maybe you want to join me. I'll make sure you're dressed in something beautiful, you'll get food, and, well, I'll pay you for your time." The woman stared at him, her brow furrowing in disbelief. "Why me?" she asked, her voice wary. "Because," Jason said with a small smile, "sometimes it's the people no one expects that make the biggest impact." There was a long pause. She looked down at her hands, the wind biting at her face, as though weighing the offer. She didn't know whether to trust this strange man, but something about his tone, his calmness, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a cruel joke. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice quiet. "No catch," Jason replied, standing up. "I just need a date. It'll be a few hours, and then you can go back to your life. But for today, you'll be my guest. I'll take care of everything." Her stomach growled softly, reminding her of how long it had been since she'd eaten a proper meal. The idea of being at a luxurious wedding, with fancy food and beautiful clothes, felt like something out of a dream. But could she trust him? She looked up at him again, this time seeing a flicker of sincerity in his eyes. "Okay," she whispered, finally deciding. "I'll do it." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of triumph. This was going to be the most memorable wedding Vanessa had ever had. He motioned toward his car, and they drove through the city to a high-end boutique where Jason had already arranged for her to be dressed in something that would turn heads. At the shop, the staff looked at the woman with raised eyebrows as she nervously stood among racks of expensive dresses. She felt out of place, like a fish out of water, but Jason encouraged her. "Pick anything you like," he said warmly, as if they had known each other for years. Hesitantly, she reached for a simple but elegant navy blue gown. Jason nodded approvingly. "You'll look stunning in that." An hour later, she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection almost unrecognizable. Her tangled hair was now smooth, cascading down her back, and her face, freshly cleaned and lightly made up, had a softness to it that hadn't been visible before. The woman staring back at her wasn't the homeless girl from the streets. For a brief moment, she felt like she was living someone else's life. Jason, standing behind her, admired her transformation. "Perfect," he said, with a satisfied smile. "Now, are you ready?" She took a deep breath, nodding, though her heart raced with nerves. This was all too surreal. She had no idea what to expect. When they arrived at the wedding, heads immediately turned. Jason, the successful entrepreneur, walking in with an unknown woman by his side, was enough to cause murmurs. But the whispers grew louder as people began to realize she wasn't part of their world. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why was Jason with her? Vanessa, radiant in her wedding dress, caught sight of them from across the room. Her smile faltered for a second, confusion flickering in her eyes as she took in the scene. Jason could almost see the gears turning in her mind. He gave her a small, knowing smile as he led his date to the reception area. As the night progressed, the tension in the air grew thicker. Eyes followed them wherever they went, and Jason could feel the weight of the judgmental stares. But the woman by his side, though nervous, held her head high. There was something powerful in her presence, a quiet strength that nobody had anticipated. They sat at a table near the back, away from the bride and groom, but it was clear that the attention was on them. Jason could sense the unease growing among the guests. This wasn't part of the plan, and people like Vanessa, people obsessed with appearances and status, didn't like surprises. Then, just as the first course was being served, something happened that no one could have expected. Vanessa stood up from her seat and began walking toward them, her face unreadable. The room fell silent, the clinking of silverware and quiet conversation suddenly gone. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as Vanessa approached. Her eyes locked on the woman sitting next to him. What was she going to say? What was she thinking? Everyone in the room was watching, waiting for the confrontation that was sure to come. And then, Vanessa spoke. What she said next would change everything. But that's when the unexpected twist hit, a moment so shocking, so unbelievable, that the entire wedding came to a standstill. Vanessa stopped just a few feet from their table, her gaze fixed on the woman Jason had brought with him. There was a pause, long enough for the tension to grow almost unbearable. Jason shifted slightly in his seat, but the homeless woman, now dressed elegantly, sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the weight of Vanessa's eyes, but she didn't flinch. It was as if all the noise in the room had disappeared, and all that remained was this moment of confrontation. Jason, Vanessa finally said, her voice smooth but with an edge. I didn't expect to see you here. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the woman sitting beside him before returning to Jason's face. And with a guest, no less. Jason smiled coolly, his confidence never wavering. Well, I couldn't miss the big day, he replied, his tone light but layered with meaning. And yes, I brought someone with me. I thought it would be interesting. Vanessa's lips twitched, the hint of a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something deeper behind her expression, something Jason couldn't quite place. Was it anger? Jealousy? Or just plain curiosity? She glanced once more at the woman beside him, but still said nothing directly to her. It was as if Vanessa was trying to make sense of what Jason was doing, trying to figure out if this was some kind of game, a petty attempt at getting under her skin. You always did like making things interesting, Vanessa said softly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. But I'm curious, Jason, who is she? The room seemed to hold its breath as Jason glanced toward the woman beside him. She had been silent throughout the exchange, her fingers now lightly tracing the edge of the tablecloth. Her heart was racing, but she didn't show it. What was she supposed to say? Should she explain herself? Or just sit there and let Jason handle it? She had no idea how to navigate this world, this strange, polished place where every look and gesture held meaning. This is Emily, Jason said after a moment, his voice steady. She's with me today. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly at the name, as if searching her memory for any hint of recognition, but finding none. Emily, she repeated, her voice carefully measured. And where did you meet, Emily? Jason tilted his head, knowing exactly what Vanessa was getting at. She wasn't just curious about who Emily was. She wanted to know if this was some sort of trick, if Jason had brought someone unexpected, just to throw her off balance on her wedding day. But Jason remained calm, his smile never faltering. We met recently, he said vaguely, knowing that giving too much information would only spoil the game. She's someone special. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, feeling a strange mix of emotions wash over her. Part of her wanted to disappear, to fade into the background and let this moment pass without further attention. But another part of her, a small part that had been buried deep under years of hardship, felt something else. A flicker of pride, maybe? It was hard to say. She hadn't been treated as someone important in so long that she barely recognized the feeling. Vanessa's gaze lingered on Emily for a few more moments, as if she could somehow see through her, as if she could uncover the truth with just a glance. But Emily remained silent, her face carefully blank, not giving anything away. "Well," Vanessa finally said, her voice light but edged with something sharper, "I hope you both enjoy the evening." She turned sharply on her heel and walked away, her white dress trailing elegantly behind her. Jason watched her go, his smile still in place but his eyes now clouded with something darker. You could feel the eyes of the other guests on him, their whispers like a low hum in the background. But Jason didn't care. In fact, he relished it. This was exactly what he had wanted. To be noticed. To disrupt the perfect image that Vanessa had worked so hard to cultivate. Emily let out a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The whole exchange had left her feeling strange, like she was a pawn in some game she didn't fully understand. But there was no turning back now. She was in this, whether she liked it or not. Jason leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. He could see the curious stares, the subtle glances from across the tables. People were talking, speculating about who Emily was and why Jason had brought her. That was exactly the reaction he had hoped for. But beneath his calm exterior, there was something else, something unsettled. Bringing Emily here had been a bold move, but now, as the night unfolded, he found himself wondering if he had underestimated how this would all play out. Emily, sensing his unease, glanced over at him. "Was that your ex?" she asked quietly, even though she already knew the answer. "Yeah," Jason said, his voice soft. "That was Vanessa." Emily nodded, unsure of what else to say. She felt out of place, like she was trespassing in someone else's life. But there was no escaping it now. She was here, and whatever this was, she was a part of it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension and unspoken words. Vanessa and her new husband moved through the room, greeting guests and basking in the glow of their perfect day. But every once in a while, Vanessa's eyes would drift toward Jason and Emily, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Emily felt it too, the weight of the stares, the whispers that followed them wherever they went. She tried to eat, but her appetite was gone. The food, though exquisite, felt like dust in her mouth. Jason, for all his confidence earlier, was now quieter, more distant. It was as if the reality of the situation was sinking in, and even he wasn't sure where things would go from here. As the evening drew to a close, Jason stood and offered Emily his arm. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. Emily nodded and followed him, grateful to leave the tension-filled room behind. But as they reached the door, a voice called out from behind them. It was Vanessa. "Wait," she said, her voice louder now, enough to catch the attention of the remaining guests. Jason stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face her. Emily stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. Vanessa stepped forward, her eyes locked on Jason. There was something in her gaze now, something sharp and intense. "Before you leave," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "I need to know the truth. Why did you really bring her here?" The room fell silent once again, every eye focused on them. Jason's face remained unreadable, but Emily could sense the storm brewing inside him. Whatever he said next would change everything. Jason stood there, his arms still linked with Emily's, but his body now tense. His mind raced as he processed Vanessa's words. Why did he bring Emily to the wedding? Was it just to make a statement, to show Vanessa that he had moved on? Or was there something deeper, something he wasn't even ready to admit to himself? He glanced at Emily, who remained quiet beside him, her face a mask of calm despite the tension hanging in the air. She didn't seem angry or upset, just waiting. Waiting for what? Jason wasn't sure anymore. He felt as though he was being pulled in two different directions, and neither one led anywhere good. Vanessa stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on Jason. Her expression was hard to read, but Jason knew her well enough to see that this was more than just curiosity. There was something personal behind her question, something she needed to understand. Maybe, in some way, she wanted closure too. After all, their relationship had ended so abruptly, so messily, that neither of them had ever really had a chance to say what needed to be said. "I brought her because I wanted you to see," Jason finally said, his voice steady but low. He didn't break eye contact with Vanessa, his words deliberate. I wanted you to see that I've moved on. I'm not the person you left behind. The room remained silent, all eyes now shifting between the two of them, waiting for what would happen next. Emily stood still, feeling as though she was an outsider in this exchange, despite being the center of it all. She wondered what she represented to Jason in this moment. Was she just a symbol of his attempt to rebuild himself after Vanessa, or was there something real between them? She didn't know, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find out. Not in this room, not in front of everyone. Vanessa's lips pressed together into a thin line, and for a moment, Jason thought he saw a flicker of something vulnerable cross her face. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, almost calculating look. You think bringing her here proves that? Vanessa asked, her voice sharp. You think parading some random woman around at my wedding is going to show me anything other than how petty you become? Emily felt the sting of Vanessa's words, though they weren't directed at her. But Jason didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his jaw tight. You don't know anything about her, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. She's not just some random woman. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her gaze flicking toward Emily. Then tell me, Jason, who is she? What is she to you? Jason hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emily felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't expected to be thrown into the middle of someone else's complicated past. And yet, here she was, being used as a piece in whatever game Jason and Vanessa were playing. She felt the weight of the moment, the expectations hanging in the air, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer to Vanessa's question. Before Jason could respond, a voice broke through the tension. It was a man's voice, firm and authoritative, coming from the direction of the wedding party. Vanessa's new husband, Robert, stepped forward, his expression calm but unreadable. He had been silent for most of the evening, content to let his bride handle the drama, but now it seemed he had decided to intervene. Maybe this isn't the time or place for this, Robert said, his voice level as he addressed both Jason and Vanessa. It's our wedding day after all. Let's not turn it into something it doesn't need to be. Vanessa glanced at her husband, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to Jason, her expression hardening. You always did like making a scene, she said quietly, before turning on her heel and walking away, leaving Jason and Emily standing in the middle of the room, with all eyes still on them. Jason let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Emily could feel the weight of the moment beginning to lift, but the question still hung in the air, unanswered. Who was she to Jason, and why had he really brought her here? As they left the reception hall, the whispers of the other guests followed them out, but neither of them spoke. The night air outside was cool, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere they had just left behind. Emily finally broke the silence. Jason, she said softly, her voice steady but unsure. Why did you bring me here? Was it really just to make a point to Vanessa? Jason stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression was hard to read, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just about Vanessa, he said after a long pause. I wanted you to be here because I needed someone with me. Someone who wasn't part of all this mess. Emily frowned, not quite understanding. But you could have brought anyone, she said quietly. Why me? Jason's gaze softened, and for the first time that night, she saw something genuine in his expression. Because you're different, he said simply. You're not like everyone else I know. You don't care about all the things they care about. You're real. Emily didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't used to being called anything other than forgotten, invisible. And now, here she was, standing in front of a man who barely knew her, being told that she was something special. It didn't make sense, and yet there was something about Jason's words that felt true. But even as he spoke, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he was letting on. There was still so much she didn't understand about Jason, about his past with Vanessa, about why he had chosen her to bring into this world of wealth and privilege. It felt like there was something lurking beneath the surface, something he wasn't ready to tell her yet. As they stood there in the quiet night, the unresolved tension between them hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to break. Emily knew that whatever happened next would change everything, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for the answers. The car ride back to Jason's apartment was silent, tension thick in the air between them. Emily stared out of the window, watching the city lights blur past, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the evening's events over and over. The wedding, Vanessa's sharp words, Jason's cryptic explanations. It all felt surreal, like she was caught in someone else's life. Jason kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He hadn't said much since they left the venue, and Emily could sense that he was just as conflicted as she was. There was so much left unsaid, but neither of them seemed ready to face the conversation that was hanging between them. As they pulled into the parking garage beneath Jason's building, Emily finally broke the silence. "You still haven't really answered my question," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "Why me? Why bring me into all of this when you could have left things alone?" Jason parked the car but didn't immediately respond. He sat there for a moment, his hands still resting on the wheel, his jaw clenched. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "Because I didn't want to go through tonight alone," he admitted quietly. "It wasn't just about proving something to Vanessa. I needed someone with me who wasn't tied to my past. Someone who could remind me that there's more to life than this drama." Emily absorbed his words, but they didn't fully answer the deeper question that had been gnawing at her all night. There was still something he wasn't saying, and the weight of it pressed down on her. She could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to come out. "But why me?" she pressed, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "You barely know me. What made you think I was the person you needed?" Jason looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, she saw a vulnerability in him that he had been trying to hide all night. "I don't know," he said honestly. I saw something in you. When we met, there was something about you that made me feel like maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought." Emily didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't used to being seen in that way, like she could be someone's anchor, someone's hope. She had spent so long drifting through life, unnoticed and forgotten, that the idea of being important to someone like Jason felt foreign. And yet, here he was, telling her that she mattered in ways she couldn't fully understand. But even as his words sank in, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Jason was hiding something, and whatever it was bigger than just Vanessa or their complicated past. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a secret that he wasn't ready to share. They got out of the car and made their way up to Jason's apartment in silence. Once inside, Jason offered her something to drink, but Emily declined. She wasn't in the mood for small talk or distractions. She needed answers. "Jason," she said quietly, standing in the middle of his living room as he fidgeted in the kitchen. "There's something you're not telling me." Jason froze, his back to her as he poured himself a glass of water. He didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Emily took a step closer, her voice firm but gentle. "You brought me to that wedding for a reason, and it wasn't just to have someone by your side. There's something more, isn't there?" Jason set the glass down on the counter, his shoulders tense. He didn't turn to face her, but she could see the conflict in his posture, the way his hands gripped the edge of the countertop like he was holding himself together. "You're right," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "There is more, but I didn't want to drag you into it. I didn't want you to get hurt." Emily's heart skipped a beat at his words. "Hurt? What do you mean?" Jason turned around slowly, his expression dark and filled with regret. "Vanessa, she's not who you think she is. None of this is what it seems." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of his cryptic words. "What are you talking about?" Jason ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room as he struggled to find the right words. "Vanessa and I, we didn't just break up because we grew apart. It was more complicated than that. There were people involved, people who didn't want us together. Powerful people." Emily's stomach twisted with unease. "What kind of people?" Jason stopped pacing, turning to face her with a grim expression. "People who control more than just wealth and status. People who can ruin lives with a single decision." The room seemed to close in around Emily as the weight of Jason's words settled over her. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the seriousness in his tone sent a chill down her spine. This was no longer just about a messy breakup or unresolved feelings. There was something much bigger at play, something dangerous. "Jason, you need to tell me what's going on," she said, her voice steady but laced with fear. "If I'm involved in this now, I deserve to know the truth." Jason sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his secret was finally too much to bear. "You're right. You do deserve to know. But I don't know if I can protect you from what's coming." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and confusion. What's coming? Jason's eyes locked onto hers, his expression filled with a mix of fear and determination. There are people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. And now that you've been seen with me, you're part of this too. Emily felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. She had no idea what Jason was talking about, but the urgency in his voice, the look in his eyes, it told her that whatever this was, it was far from over. Before she could respond, Jason's phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone before he finally picked it up, his face pale as he read the message. Emily watched him, her heart racing as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Whatever was happening, it was coming faster than either of them had anticipated. Jason looked up at her, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to go. Now." Emily's breath caught in her throat as Jason's words sank in. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and without another word, she grabbed her coat, following him to the door. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. Who were these people? Why was she suddenly caught up in this mess? The fear in Jason's eyes told her that whatever was happening, it was dangerous. Jason's phone buzzed again as they rushed down the hallway, his fingers gripping it tightly. Emily noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hand shook ever so slightly as he glanced at the screen. Without saying anything, he shoved the phone back into his pocket and increased his pace, guiding her toward the stairwell instead of the elevator. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, trying to keep up with him as they descended the stairs. She could feel the unease building in her chest, a gnawing sense of dread. Jason's response was tight-lipped, his voice low as he muttered, "They know where I live. We need to get out of here before they close in." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't the Jason she had met only days ago, the one who seemed in control, calm, and confident. This Jason was tense, almost panicked, and the shift made everything feel far more real. Whoever these people were, they were not messing around, and Emily suddenly felt a wave of regret for ever agreeing to go to that wedding. They burst out of the building into the cold night air, and Jason immediately scanned the street, his eyes darting back and forth like he was expecting someone. Or something. Emily followed his gaze, but all she saw was the usual city traffic, people going about their lives. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, just as they reached Jason's car, a sleek black vehicle pulled up across the street. Emily's stomach twisted as two men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise and calculated. Jason tensed beside her, grabbing her arm and pulling her quickly into the car. "Don't look at them," Jason muttered under his breath, starting the engine with a shaky hand. "Just act normal." Emily's pulse raced as she tried to steady her breathing. The men hadn't made any move to follow them yet, but she could feel their eyes on her as Jason pulled out of the parking space and drove off, merging into the busy traffic. For a moment, they were both silent, the tension between them palpable. Emily could see Jason's grip tighten on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated through the streets with purpose. "Jason," she began, her voice trembling, "you need to tell me everything. Who are those people? Why are they after you?" Jason exhaled, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's not just me they're after anymore," he said grimly. "It's you too. They saw us together at the wedding. Now they'll assume you're involved." "Involved in what?" Emily demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "I don't even know what's going on." Jason hesitated, glancing at her briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "It's complicated, Vanessa. She's connected to something much bigger than just her family's wealth. There are people she's involved with, people who make their money in ways that aren't exactly legal." Emily's mind reeled as she processed his words. "What does that have to do with you? Or me?" Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know the full extent of it when we were together. I thought it was just business, high-stakes investments, that kind of thing. But when we broke up, I found out she was in deeper than I could have imagined. She's tied to these powerful people who control more than just money. They control industries, governments, and they don't take kindly to anyone getting in their way." Emily's heart pounded, a chill running down her spine. "And now they think I'm part of this because I went to the wedding with you." Jason nodded grimly. They'll see you as a potential threat. If they think you know something, anything, they'll come after you too. Emily's hands trembled as she tried to wrap her mind around the situation. She had thought she was just helping Jason with some petty revenge at his ex's wedding. But now, it felt like she had stumbled into something much darker, something that could put her life in danger. Just as her thoughts raced with panic, Jason swerved the car sharply to the right, pulling into an alleyway. Emily's body jerked with the sudden movement, and she gasped as he quickly turned off the engine, plunging them into darkness. "Stay quiet," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily's heart thudded loudly in her chest as she glanced behind them. The black car from before had reappeared, slowly creeping down the main road just beyond the alley. Jason ducked lower in his seat, motioning for Emily to do the same. They sat there in silence. The only sound Emily could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She dared not move, her breath shallow as they waited. The car paused at the entrance of the alley, its headlights illuminating the walls for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the car moved on, continuing down the street, but the fear still clung to Emily, refusing to let go. Jason exhaled slowly, but there was no relief in his expression. "They're not giving up," he murmured. "They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Emily looked at him, her voice shaky. "And what exactly do they want?" Jason hesitated for a long moment before he finally answered, his voice low and filled with regret. "Vanessa, and anything, or anyone, standing in their way." Emily's heart sank. She had been pulled into a nightmare, and now, there was no easy way out. The stakes had just been raised, and the danger was real. Jason's eyes darted back and forth, scanning the alley for any sign of movement. The tension in the air was thick, and Emily's stomach churned with anxiety. She had no idea how they were going to get out of this situation. Something told her that whatever Jason had planned, it wasn't going to be easy. "We can't stay here," Jason whispered, his voice low but urgent. "They'll find us eventually." Emily nodded, her mouth dry as she tried to push down the fear bubbling up inside her. "So what do we do?" Jason paused for a moment, glancing at her with a mixture of regret and determination. "We go to Vanessa." Emily blinked in shock. "What? You want to go to her? After everything?" Jason nodded, his jaw set. "She's the only one who can stop this. If we confront her directly, maybe, just maybe, we can convince her to call off her people. She knows me well enough to know I won't back down." Emily's mind raced. The idea of facing Vanessa again, after everything that had happened at the wedding, seemed like a terrible idea. But what choice did they have? They were being hunted, and running would only delay the inevitable. Jason started the car again, his movements deliberate but tense. Emily could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. There was no hesitation in his actions. He had made up his mind, and now they were headed straight into the lion's den. As they drove, Emily couldn't help but feel the gravity of what was about to happen. The city lights blurred past them, and the silence in the car was suffocating. She wanted to ask Jason what his plan was, but part of her feared the answer. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be simple. Finally, they pulled up to an extravagant mansion, Vanessa's place. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they parked outside the gates, the sprawling estate looming over them like something out of a nightmare. Jason took a deep breath and looked at Emily, his eyes filled with an unspoken apology. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for dragging you into this. I never wanted any of this to happen." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. "We'll figure it out. We have to." With that, Jason got out of the car, and Emily followed, her legs shaky beneath her. They approached the gate, and Jason hit the intercom, his voice firm and commanding as he demanded to speak with Vanessa. For a moment, there was only silence, but then the gates slowly creaked open, inviting them inside. As they walked up the driveway, Emily's stomach twisted into knots. The air felt heavy with anticipation, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. When they reached the front door, it swung open before they could knock, revealing Vanessa standing there, a cold smile on her lips. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with amusement. "I suppose you realize there's no running from this." Jason's expression hardened. "We need to talk." Vanessa stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. Emily hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn around and run, but Jason gave her a reassuring look, and she forced herself to follow him inside. The interior of the mansion was just as opulent as Emily had imagined, but there was something unsettling about it now. The lavish decor felt more like a trap than a display of wealth. Vanessa led them to a large, dimly lit room where two men in suits stood by the door, watching their every move. Jason didn't waste any time. "Call them off," he demanded, his voice steady but filled with tension. "You don't need to involve Emily in this. It's between you and me." Vanessa laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, Jason, you really think it's that simple? This isn't just about you anymore. Emily's part of this now, whether you like it or not." Emily's stomach dropped as Vanessa's words sank in. This wasn't going to be as easy as Jason had hoped. Vanessa's power and influence ran deeper than they'd realized. Jason stepped closer, his eyes locked on Vanessa's. "You don't have to do this. We can walk away. Both of us. Just call it off." Vanessa's smile faltered for a split second, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something in her eyes. A flicker of doubt, maybe even regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold expression. "You're in over your head, Jason," Vanessa said softly, her tone almost pitying. "This was never about you walking away. It's about control." Just then, one of the men at the door moved, his hand slipping into his jacket, and Emily's heart stopped. But before she could react, the door burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in, catching Vanessa and her guards off guard. Emily gasped, her body frozen in place as chows erupted around her. The men quickly disarmed Vanessa's guards, pinning them to the ground, while one of them stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating as he turned to Jason. "Jason," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We've been watching you." Jason looked stunned, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping protectively in front of Emily. The man smirked. "Let's just say we've been interested in your little feud with Vanessa for some time, and now that you're both here, it's time to settle things once and for all." Emily's heart raced as the tension in the room skyrocketed. She had no idea who these new players were, but it was clear that whatever was happening, it had escalated far beyond what any of them had anticipated. Before anyone could react, the man turned to Vanessa, his expression hardening. "Your little game is over, Vanessa. You've crossed too many lines." Vanessa's face paled, her confident demeanor crumbling. "What? What do you mean?" The man stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can control everything, manipulate everyone, but there are forces at play here you can't even begin to understand." Emily watched in shock as the power dynamic shifted completely. Vanessa, once so in control, now looked genuinely terrified, and Jason, caught in the middle, seemed just as stunned as she was. The man turned back to Jason, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go, but be careful, Jason. You've made powerful enemies today." With that, the men led Vanessa and her guards out of the room, leaving Jason and Emily standing there in stunned silence. Emily's mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. The danger had been real, but somehow they had survived. And yet, as they stood there in the aftermath, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Jason and Emily stood in the middle of the lavish, empty room, the tension finally lifting as silence settled around them. The men who had stormed in moments ago had disappeared as quickly as they arrived, taking Vanessa and her guards with them. The mansion, once a symbol of Vanessa's control and power, now felt hollow, its grandness diminished by the chaos that had unfolded. Emily glanced at Jason, her mind still spinning from everything that had just happened. "Who were those people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, still shaken by the whirlwind of events. Jason let out a deep breath, running his hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with disbelief. "But they've clearly been watching Vanessa for a long time. Maybe they were waiting for her to make a mistake big enough for them to step in." Emily shivered at the thought. It all felt so much bigger than them, like they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. She wondered if they were truly safe now, or if there were still shadows lurking, waiting to drag them back into the conflict. Jason seemed to sense her unease. He gently took her hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding her amidst the confusion. "It's over, Emily," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "At least for us." She nodded, wanting to believe him. A part of her couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had been irrevocably changed. Jason had gone up against Vanessa, and while it seemed like the battle was over, the cost of that fight still weighed heavily on them both. The tangled web of emotions between them, the unresolved past, the hurt, the unexpected alliance against Vanessa, left a lingering sense of uncertainty. They walked out of the mansion together, the night air cool against their skin. The city felt distant, the hum of life beyond the estate almost surreal after the storm they had just weathered. Jason stopped by the car, turning to face Emily. "I'm sorry for everything," he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to drag you into this mess. I didn't know how else to deal with Vanessa." Emily looked at him, her emotions swirling. She had been furious with him, confused and scared, all in the span of a few days. But underneath it all, she could see how much he was trying to make things right. She wasn't sure if they could ever go back to the way things were before all of this, but she didn't want to hold on to the anger anymore. "Maybe we both made some mistakes," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But we got through it. Together." Jason smiled, a small, tired smile, but it was genuine. "I couldn't have done it without you." They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything finally beginning to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily let herself breathe. She had spent so much time feeling lost, doubting herself, but in the midst of all the chaos, she had found a strength she didn't know she had. As they got into the car and drove away from the mansion, Emily stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker past. She thought about Vanessa, how her obsession with control had led to her downfall. It was strange, thinking about how someone who once seemed so untouchable had crumbled under the weight of her own schemes. In the end, Vanessa had been her own worst enemy. Jason broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think she'll come back from this?" Emily hesitated, considering. "I don't know," she said finally. "People like Vanessa, they don't just disappear. But whatever happens, I think we need to focus on moving forward, away from her." Jason nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you're right." They drove in silence for a while, both of them lost in thought. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many things left unsaid between them. But for now, the urgency of the moment was gone. The danger had passed, and they could begin to think about the future, whatever that might look like. As they approached Emily's apartment, Jason slowed the car, his expression more serious. "Emily," he began, glancing over at her, "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything after all of this. I'm just glad we're both okay." She smiled, appreciating the sentiment. "I know, Jason. I also know that we've been through a lot together. And maybe that means something." He parked the car and turned toward her, the tension from earlier replaced by something softer, more hopeful. "Does that mean you'll give me another chance?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. Emily considered him for a moment, weighing everything they had gone through, all the ups and downs. It hadn't been easy, but despite everything, Jason had shown her a side of himself she hadn't expected, the side that cared, that fought for what was right, even when it meant going up against someone like Vanessa. "I think we both deserve another chance," she said with a small smile. Jason's face lit up with relief, and he reached out to gently squeeze her hand. "Thank you." As they sat there in the quiet of the car, the weight of the past few days began to melt away. There was still so much to figure out, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like things might just be okay. They said their goodbyes, and Emily stepped out of the car, watching as Jason drove off into the night. She stood there for a moment, feeling the cool breeze on her face, and smiled. It wasn't the ending she had expected when she first agreed to go to Vanessa's wedding, but it was an ending that felt right. As she walked up to her apartment, Emily couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Life had a strange way of throwing unexpected challenges her way, but she had come out of this stronger, more certain of who she was and what she wanted. Maybe this wasn't just the end of a crazy chapter in her life. Maybe it was the beginning of something better, something she had always deserved.